I died on January 31st, 1945. I was 24 years old. They shot me in a courtyard in a village in France at 10 in the morning. 11 rifles. One man. 49,000 Americans were convicted of desertion in the Second World War. I am the only one they executed. I have spent a long time thinking about what I did differently from the other 48,999. The answer is not what most people think. I was not the worst deserter. I was the most honest one. I grew up in Detroit. I was not a good kid in the way that gets you remembered fondly. I stole things, I got caught, I did time in reform school and later in prison. By the time the draft found me in 1944, I had a criminal record and a wife named Antoinette, who I loved more than I had loved anything in my life up to that point, and who was the first person who had ever made me feel like I was worth something. I was 23 years old and I had just figured out how to be a person, and then they sent me to France. What I'm about to tell you, 49,000 men deserted in that war. 49,000. The army prosecuted them, imprisoned them, reduced them in rank, sent them back to their units. They executed one. The question of why it was me, why I was the example they needed to make, is the question I have been sitting with since the rifles fired. I think I know the answer, and I think you will too by the end of this. I arrived in France in August 1944 as a replacement soldier. One of the men fed into units that had already been fighting since D-Day, already depleted, already carrying the specific weight of months of combat that replacements were expected to absorb immediately and without complaint. I got separated from my unit in the chaos of the advance. I found myself attached to a Canadian unit for 6 weeks, moving with them, surviving with them, and in those 6 weeks I had enough time to understand exactly what the front was going to ask me to do and exactly what I was going to be unable to do. I was not a coward. I want to say that plainly. Cowardice is an absence of will in the face of danger. What I had was not an absence of will. What I had was a clear-eyed understanding of my own limits, the specific knowledge that I was not built for what combat required, and that sending me to the front would not produce a useful soldier, but would produce a man who froze, who failed the men beside him, who became a liability at the moment the situation required the opposite. I understood this about myself. I reported it. That is the part that made me different from the 48,999 others. When I was finally assigned to the 28th Infantry Division in October 1944, I reported to my unit and I told my commanding officer directly that I could not go into combat. I said it out loud. I did not go absent without leave and hope nobody noticed. I did not run and get caught. I stood in front of my commanding officer and I told him the truth about what I was and what I was not, and I said that I would do any other job they needed done, cook, labor, anything that kept me from the front line, but that I could not go into combat, and that if they sent me, I would run again. He told me to write it down. I wrote it down. I wrote a letter explaining my position in plain language, that I had deserted before, that I would desert again if sent to the front, and that I was surrendering myself and asking to be punished, rather than return to combat. I understood that what I was doing carried serious consequences. I wrote it anyway because I had been told my whole life that honesty was a virtue, and I was trying, for perhaps the first time consistently, to be a person who acted according to what he believed rather than what was convenient. They took the letter, they filed it, and then the army did something I did not expect, though in retrospect I should have. They used it The letter I wrote as a statement of personal truth became the primary evidence in my court-martial. My honesty became my prosecution. Every word I had written in good faith was read back to me as proof of deliberate, premeditated desertion, the worst possible framing of the most honest thing I had ever done. I was convicted. I was sentenced to death. I wrote to Eisenhower. I explained the situation. I asked for clemency. I told him about Antoinette. I told him that I was not asking to avoid all punishment, that I accepted the court-martial, the sentence, whatever they decided short of death. I asked him to understand that executing me wouldn't make the other deserters braver, that fear does not respond to execution orders, that if a man cannot go to the front, shooting him in a courtyard does not address the reason he could not go. Eisenhower reviewed the case. His staff reviewed the case. They were aware that 49,000 men had deserted. They were aware that the war was not yet over and that the army needed soldiers who would stay at the front. They decided that an example was required. I was the example. The morning of January 31st, 1945 was cold. They read the order. They tied me to a post in a courtyard in the village of Sainte-Marie, aux Mines. There were 11 men with rifles. The first volley did not kill me. So I was still alive after the first shots, and they had to finish it. I do not know how long it took after the first volley. I know that I had asked to see a priest, and they had given me one, and I had confessed. And I had thought about Antoinette, and I had thought that I hoped she would find someone who deserved her, because I had tried to, and I wasn't sure I had managed it. The army did not notify Antoinette of my execution for 10 months. She found out in November 1945, after the war was over, while other women were welcoming their husbands home. She never remarried. 49,000 men deserted. The army needed one executed to demonstrate that desertion carried consequences. They needed the example to have a name and a face and a file. And my file was the most complete, the most explicit, the most unambiguous, because I had written it myself, in my own words, in good faith, believing that honesty was the right approach to a situation I could not otherwise resolve. The bravest thing I ever did was tell the truth about who I was and what I could and could not do. They shot me for it. I do not ask you to call me a hero. I am not a hero. I was a man with a criminal record and a wife he loved, and a clear understanding of his own limits, and a belief, perhaps naive, perhaps simply wrong, that telling the truth about those limits was the honorable thing to do. 49,000 men ran. One man stood still and wrote it down. They shot the one who stood still. I have thought about whether I would do it differently, whether I would have written the letter, whether honesty was the right currency to spend in an institution that needed examples more than it needed truth. I think I would write the letter again, not because it worked, because it was true, and because Antoinette deserved a man who told the truth. Even at the end, even when the truth was this, I loved her. I was afraid. I told them both things clearly. That is what I had. That is all I had, and I gave it. Antoinette waited 10 months to find out. 10 months of not knowing, of writing letters that went unanswered, of asking questions that the army deflected with the specific bureaucratic patience of an institution that has decided not to tell you something yet. November 1945, the war over, the men coming home on ships and trains and buses, returning to streets and kitchens and the ordinary furniture of lives that had been paused. She found out while that was happening. While other women were cooking meals and setting extra places at the table, someone told Antoinette that her husband had been shot by the United States Army in a courtyard in France in January, and that they were sorry for her loss. She spent the next years trying to get the back pay, the life insurance, $70,000 that the army owed and would not pay because of the conviction. She wrote letters. She hired lawyers. She argued the case through every channel available to a woman in Detroit in the late 1940s with no money and no connections, and a husband whose name the army had made into a cautionary tale. She received nothing. She died in 1979. They buried us next to each other eventually in Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit after a journalist spent years making it happen. I had been in French soil for 42 years. They brought me home. We are next to each other now. That is something. It is not enough, but it is something. And I have learned to take what is available rather than grieve indefinitely for what is not. She never remarried. I knew she wouldn't. She was that kind of person. The kind who means it when they mean it. I was lucky to have been meant. Luckier than I deserved, probably. Luckier than the army thought I was worth. I loved her. That was always true, that they could not take.